This story of our travels began in Cappadocia, a region in southeast Turkey where primitive prehistoric settlements became an area of peasant culture and agriculture, with cave dwellings hewn out of the rock. In those cave dwellings, the work of unknown early Christian and Byzantine artists can still be seen. Here, man found a way to turn a hostile, seemingly uninhabitable district into a congenial place. A parent rock that offered protection to people whose lives were in constant danger. This anthill of a region owed its constant growth and its equally constant dangers to its position. In fact, Cappadocia was a compulsory route involving friendly and not so friendly encounters for anyone traveling between the Aegean Sea and the Taurus Mountains. And it is still a natural corridor which we too are obliged to travel through in our journey towards Arabia. A journey in search of secret underground cities. Witness the marvels of Petra, a fossil city carved out of the soft red rock of Jordan. Here, in the heart of this wonderful complex, we will find a host of marvelous sights, ever-present reminders of a glorious past. In this deep valley between Palestine and Arabia, in the 4th century before Christ, an intrepid tribe of nomads settled, the Nabateans. It was they who built the city of Petra, cutting it into the rock. Today, remains of their unique achievement can still be seen, like this imposing sepulchral temple. Petra thrived in ancient times because its location made it an ideal place and halt for all who traveled between Arabia and the Mediterranean. People stopped here to rest and trade. Nowadays, occasional groups of Bedouins camp where caravans loaded with precious wares used to call. Petra was a place to do business, but also an important meeting point where friends and alliances were made. In addition to houses and warehouses, the Nabateans also carved magnificent monumental tombs and sacrificial altars. Their architecture is quite unusual, a composite style that reflects the influence of distant worlds linked to Petra by trade. Worlds like those of Rome and Greece that lay across the sea. And the pre-Islamic world that lay across the desert to the east in southern Arabia. Petra acted as a hub, collecting and distributing wealth in such great quantity that eventually it became a target for Rome's arrogance and greed. And so the proud Nabateans, who for 500 years had warded off the Assyrians, the Persians, the Medes, and the Macedonians, were conquered by the Romans in the 1st century BC. The Nabateans were deprived of their independence, first on an economic level and then politically. Petra became a Roman colony and eventually a ghost town. The ghostly stones of the Nabateans have become a campsite for nomads, who for nearly 2 centuries have acted as guides for a continuous flow of historians and archaeologists, who have been studying Petra ever since Swiss scholar Johann Ludwig Burckhardt first discovered this extraordinary fossil city in 1814. Today, research projects are underway here, above and below ground, in an ongoing attempt to learn more and more about this extraordinary place and its role as a terminus for traders navigating, so to speak, across the Arabian desert, and who cross the sun-scorched, hostile mountain ranges which have to be tackled by anyone coming from the south, from the Arabian world, on their way north to the Mediterranean. At each end of this often hazardous journey, there were terminals and markets in which the merchandise carried by caravans was offered for sale. Prices were high enough to compensate for undertaking this exhausting trek, which lasted for weeks on end across utterly barren terrain. In fact, only radar makes it possible for us to faithfully follow the trails beaten by the caravans of yore. Here they are on this map, which shows how they linked the Erythraean Sea, as the Indian Ocean was known in those days, with the ports of the Mediterranean, where precious wares were forwarded by ship to markets in Rome, in Alexandria, and in other major cities of the Mediterranean world. Nowadays, pipelines run along many sections of these ancient routes, carrying, once more from south to north, another very different kind of wealth, crude oil, whose reserves in this desert are among the largest in the world. Pipelines and roads. Safe routes for crossing the whole of Arabia down to its southernmost borders, where more fossil cities bear witness, like Petra, to a world that prospered in the desert at the other end of the caravan routes. Collections of ghostly stones that await us in southern Arabia. We'll get there after we've crossed this barren section of desert, where the sand is punctuated with rocks. Patches of scrub begin to appear in the utter desolation. We have another day and another night of traveling ahead of us. At dawn tomorrow, we'll reach our destination. Southern Arabia, its mountains, its valleys. Here, the first human settlements date back 200,000 years. Here, a race of nomads, after wandering for years from desert to desert, found a permanent homeland. They were herdsmen and breeders who, generation after generation, were to become arable farmers and town dwellers. The proud inhabitants of southern Arabia, today known as Yemenites. Today, like yesterday, wary of strangers. When they were herdsmen, they chose to live in these valleys because there was an abundant supply of water. In fact, in the general aridness of the Arabian Peninsula, here in the south, springs are more plentiful, and rainfall is more regular. For this reason, the vegetation here was certainly rich enough for the people of ancient times to give the region the name of Arabia Felix. This was the starting point for caravans of exotic wares. Today, roads along those same routes traced by caravans are used by trucks plying between Yemen's towns and valleys. Arabia Felix. Felix, Latin for happy, because the skies here are often full of clouds. Rains and mist are commonplace, ensuring a supply of precious water from the sky and from subterranean springs. An area rich in humidity, and therefore full of fertility, unknown in the rest of Arabia. The climate encouraged the development of agriculture, limited-scale mountain farming, which nevertheless gave rise to the first Yemenite cities, and the towers to defend the cultivated valleys. As if by magic, a ghost town materializes in the clouds, Yatiyeh. In the valleys below lies the agricultural land, which was the mainstay of the city and its economy. But it was not only the certainty of regular harvests of agricultural produce which brought joy to this world hanging in the clouds, the legendary Kingdom of Saba, also known as Sheba. Its cities, in fact, were walled in and perched on these impregnable rocky heights because, apart from the wealth harvested from the fields, they had other far greater riches to defend. Through these valleys passed caravans loaded with frankincense and myrrh. The cities of Sheba, Ma'in, and Hadramut controlled the production of these precious wares, and their towers protected the caravan routes. Frankincense was much in demand for propitiatory ceremonies and funerals. Myrrh was used in the preparation of perfumes and medicinal products. This trade gave birth to cities which were to become prosperous and powerful. Shabwa, Timna, Marib, Ganau, and Barakesh, and Yallah, discovered only in 1985. What happened to bring about the fall of the Kingdom of Sheba? Its decline, so historians tell us, was triggered, among other things, by the advent of no less than 4 religions in a mere 3 centuries. Judaism, Christianity, introduced by Ethiopian missionaries, Zoroastrianism, following the Persian invasion, and finally, Islam. Monotheistic religious systems which, by preventing cremation and banning perfumes and cosmetics, dealt a hard blow to the cultivation and commerce of frankincense and myrrh. The result was an economic recession that weakened the whole region. Ingenious irrigation systems were maintained in an increasingly slipshod way and caved in one after the other. Vegetation disappeared almost everywhere, buried by continual sandstorms. And this was the coup de grace for the Kingdom of Sheba. However, one city, despite many adversities, not only managed to survive, but expanded due to the influx of people from towns where the economy had failed. This is Sana'a. Today it is the largest city in the land once the domain of the great kings of Arabia and the Queen of Sheba, and now called the Yemen. A city of 100 palaces built of sun-dried bricks made of earth mixed with water and mud, with graceful cornices in white plaster. A fascinating city, like an illustration from the Arabian Nights. A Venice of the desert, in which life has survived much as it was in the Middle Ages, at least in those districts where the city's ethnic identity has been preserved. Elsewhere, in the suburbs, where only a few years ago everyday life was much the same as it was 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, the last decade has seen abrupt, devastating changes brought about by the onslaught of motorized traffic. The southern walls of the city, which we filmed several years ago, have been knocked down to make way for a highway. And now other districts are threatened by urban development projects. Soon, the remains of the medieval walls which protected the city against countless attacks will surrender to hordes of cars and trucks. Where this traffic now flows, there used to be massive fortifications. Even in Sana's historic center, redevelopment threatens many elegant homes and palaces, hand-built with millions of mud bricks. An architectural miracle, not only in terms of style, but of ingeniousness, patience, hard work. As is the case in desert life, nothing was left to chance in this city, where everything was designed with one goal in mind: to keep the desert at bay. How did the people wrest their gardens and fields from the arid land? How was such a large area irrigated? Irrigation? Where did the water come from? From the rain, to be sure, but also from dams, which the Sabaean civilization knew how to build in its deep valleys to retain the sky's most precious gift. A gift which for some time in this area has no longer been bestowed. Now, chronic drought is compounded by torrid winds that blow without respite, changing much of what was once Arabia Felix back into desert. The complex system of irrigation canals and sluices no longer works. Sand and dust cover the fields. Here, on the Wadi Dana, near Maghrib, are the ruins of the largest dam built in the Kingdom of Sheba. It was history's first great public works project to be built for the benefit of a community rather than to the glory of a ruler. It was an enormous construction. Here we have an idea of its size. The distance between this stone sluice tower and the other on the opposite side of the wadi is almost 1 kilometer. The dam was storing and distributing water and prosperity 100 years before the founding of Rome. The Cyclopean installation survived for 14 centuries until mud raised the level of the oasis so high that the water could no longer flow. The dam was raised several times, but eventually grew so weak that it finally collapsed. According to the Quran, the fatal floodwaters were sent by Allah to wipe out the oasis gardens and disperse the ungodly Sabaeans forever. We of the modern age know all too well that creative energy can turn into destructive energy at the drop of a hat. The ancient Sabaeans, on the other hand, were unaware of the danger. They were the first to try to interfere with the environment, and they didn't know how to guard against the risks of disrupting the balance of nature. In ancient times, green trees and crops brightened up this landscape. Today, it's virtually barren. And this is due to the ultimate transition from life to death caused by an event that can be defined in a single word: catastrophe. Yes, the collapse of the Maghrib Dam was a catastrophe, an event so dramatic that it is used in the Quran as an example of severe divine punishment. There is no doubt that the collapse of the Maghrib Dam actually happened, and as a result, a flourishing region became a fossil world. Now, the once gigantic stone dam, a symbol of civilization and prosperity, is no more than a ghostly presence. Today, in the Yemen, there are new initiatives to use the water from this wadi. In the rainy season, the Maghrib is full, and a large reservoir has been formed by the construction of a new dam upstream from the ruins of the one that collapsed 1,300 years ago. Will the desert be reclaimed? Will this unlucky region of Arabia Felix become green and fertile once again? Questions that remain to be answered, but meanwhile, the reservoir's liquid assets are already paying dividends. Irrigation is restoring fertility to the barren sand. And it becomes clear how, in the long history of the Sabaeans, their knowledge of building techniques, their tenacity, and their wisdom in handing down their knowledge made lush vegetation flourish even in the hottest wastes of the desert. And civilization sprang up in the form of cities with 100 towers. We continue our journey traveling along a desert track in search of more vestiges of the Sabaeans and their ghostly stones. We plan to film other traces left by the Sabaeans in many parts of this desert, which was not a desert in their day. The ghostly temple of Awam emerges from the sand. The so-called Biliqis sanctuary. Biliqis was the name the Arabians gave to the Queen of Sheba, a legendary figure who embodies all the fantasies conjured up by the mention of Arabia Felix. We resume our desert travels bound for the territory of the Minneans, and for other ruins which are difficult to locate in the hazy blanket of heat that envelops the horizon. At last we come to Marrakesh, the ancient town of Yatil, the most mysterious of Arabia's fossil cities. Its solid walls are deceptive, giving the impression that this isn't a dead city at all, but the exact opposite. Although Marrakesh is in plain view, we can't find the track that will take us to its walls. A word of advice from a nomad camel driver turned truck driver sets us off in the right direction. And finally, we reach our goal. Such a large city in the middle of the desert would seem to confirm tales that Arabia Felix was indeed a land covered with crops and gardens, despite the hostile environment. Archaeology has now turned these tales into historic fact, with the discovery of complex networks of canals leading off from single dams which could irrigate some 1,660 hectares of land. In other words, this stone-ridden expanse of sand was once a green, fertile plain. As the desert gradually encroached on the agricultural land, Marrakesh became a ghost city. But now, its secrets are being revealed. Working among the ruins is an Italian archaeological team led by Professor de Maigret, who's in charge of excavating this long-buried treasure. The team's goal is to restore this splendid South Arabian pearl to its former splendor. Now isolated in the desert, but once surrounded by plants and trees, Marrakesh was conquered by the Roman general Helios Gallus and then destroyed about the time of Christ. Reoccupied in the Islamic period, the city was abandoned for the last time in the 1600s when the desert took over. A page of man's history that has been lost in the mists of time. The Sabaeans are said to have taken possession of this region about 700 or 800 years before Christ, subjugating the local populations, as can be seen from these inscriptions. Later, local ethnic groups gained independence and set up autonomous kingdoms which developed simultaneously with the Kingdom of Sheba. One of these kingdoms was the Minian territory of Garnau, the capital, and Marrakesh, where the work of de Maigret's archaeologists has brought to light a temple which, according to the inscriptions studied on site, is dedicated to the god Nakrat, the patron of the city and a famous healer. It's a building with large monolithic pillars. It's possible that excavations will yield more works of art produced by the civilizations of ancient Arabia, like these precious exhibits now housed in the Archaeological Museum in Sana'a. Apart from what we have learned from local traditions and from the work of historians and archaeologists, unknown Sabaean goldsmiths also provide us with a reminder of times when fat and prolific herds grazed here, in green pastures where now not even a single blade of grass grows, and the only sign of life is the wind. The relentless desert wind which blows among those motionless ghosts.